Good evening, I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Welcome to Truth Report. Tonight, we're investigating a pattern that connects continents, from West Africa to Indonesia, from Central Asia to the Himalayas. What you're about to hear isn't just about isolated incidents. It's about power, exploitation, and who pays the price when governments and corporations prioritize profit over people and planet.
We begin in Guinea-Bissau, one of the poorest nations on Earth, where a US-funded medical study has just been suspended after international outcry. But according to reporting from Nature and Scientific American officials are insisting the study will continue despite the suspension. Let's be clear about what this study involves: withholding a proven, life-saving hepatitis B vaccine from 7,000 newborn infants.
That's right. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention provided $1.6 million to Danish researchers to randomize 14,000 babies in Guinea-Bissau. Half would receive the hepatitis B vaccine at birth as recommended, and half would have the vaccine deliberately withheld until 6 weeks of age. The stated goal? To study whether the timing of vaccination affects infant health outcomes.
Here's what makes this unconscionable: Guinea-Bissau has one of the highest hepatitis B infection rates in the world. According to the study's own background data, approximately 18% of the population carries the virus. When babies are exposed at birth, 90% develop chronic infection, and 25% of those children will die from liver cancer or liver failure caused by hepatitis B.
The medical consensus is clear and unequivocal: the hepatitis B birth dose saves lives. There is no scientific uncertainty here that justifies this experiment. Dr. Boguma Tatangi, an infectious disease researcher, stated bluntly, ethical standards do not become optional because the participants are African. African children deserve the same protections as children anywhere else.
But here's the colonial logic at work: this study would never, and I mean never, be approved in the United States or Europe. Health Policy Watch reported that conducting such research in Guinea-Bissau, research that violates basic ethical principles, reflects the same exploitative attitudes that characterized European and American treatment of Africa for centuries. The continent seen not as home to human beings with equal rights, but as a laboratory for experiments too dangerous or unethical to conduct on Western populations.
Vaccine developer Dr. Paul Offit didn't mince words. He called this RFK Jr.'s Tuskegee experiment, a reference to one of the most infamous cases of medical racism in American history. For those who need a reminder, the Tuskegee syphilis study, which started in the 1930s and continued into the 1970s, deliberately denied treatment to hundreds of black men with syphilis so researchers could observe the disease's progression. More than 100 men died as a direct result.
And now, in 2026, we're seeing the same playbook. Use vulnerable populations, in this case, African infants in a nation with minimal regulatory infrastructure, to conduct research that serves American political interests. Because make no mistake, this isn't about protecting African children. Multiple reports, including from NPR and CIDRAP News, note that the Trump administration has promoted this study as an opportunity to investigate potential negative effects of vaccines, a priority that aligns with Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s anti-vaccine activism, not with protecting infant health in Guinea-Bissau.
On January 22, Guinea-Bissau's Director General of Public Health announced at a press conference that the study was suspended pending technical and ethical review. Dr. Jean Kasia, Director General of Africa CDC, made the sovereignty issue explicit: it's the sovereignty of the country. Africa CDC is respecting and supporting the sovereignty of the country. It's not a foreign country that will come and say, this one will take place.
That statement is powerful because it names the fundamental problem: foreign powers, specifically the United States, attempting to override the health decisions of an African nation. But here's where it gets even more disturbing: despite Guinea-Bissau's suspension announcement, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services insisted the study would proceed as planned. American officials, thousands of miles away, claiming to know better than African health authorities about what should happen to African babies.
African scientists have been clear in their condemnation. As Nature reported, researchers across the continent say this study demonstrates how political pressure, funding interests, and fragmented oversight can push local health priorities aside. This isn't healthcare, it's neo-colonialism with a medical veneer.
The parallels to historical exploitation are inescapable. In the 1990s, the United States conducted AZT trials on HIV-positive African subjects, according to documentation of medical experimentation in Africa, without proper informed consent. Those trials were funded by the CDC, WHO, and NIH, the same institutions involved in this hepatitis B study. The pattern is consistent: use African populations as test subjects for research that would face insurmountable ethical barriers in the West.
So who benefits from this study? Certainly not the infants who will be denied a life-saving vaccine. The benefit accrues to American anti-vaccine activists who can point to research questioning vaccine safety, and to researchers who can publish findings that would be impossible to generate through ethical means. The cost is measured in African lives that apparently, to the CDC and HHS, matter less than American political agendas.
Now let's travel to Indonesia, where a different kind of exploitation has led to catastrophe. In November 2025, floods and landslides tore through North Sumatra, killing more than 1,000 people. But the human death toll, as horrific as it is, doesn't capture the full scale of this disaster. According to Mungabe and Inside Climate News, these floods may have wiped out between 6 and 11% of the entire global population of Tepanuli orangutans, the rarest great ape on Earth.
Let's put that in perspective. Before the floods, scientists estimated fewer than 800 Tepanuli orangutans existed in the wild, all confined to a single forest ecosystem in the Badong Toru region. The floods killed an estimated 33 to 54 individuals. Experts described this as an extinction-level disturbance. When your entire species numbers in the hundreds, losing even a few percent can be the difference between survival and extinction.
And here's the critical question: what caused these catastrophic floods? The answer, according to Indonesian government investigations and environmental scientists, is widespread deforestation linked to industrial operations. Mining companies, hydropower projects, and plantation agriculture stripped the land of its capacity to absorb rainfall and retain soil. When the cyclone hit, there was nothing to prevent the water from becoming a deadly torrent.
Indonesia's Environment Ministry didn't pull punches. They identified industrial plantations, hydropower, and gold mining as having contributed significantly to the pressure on the environment. And they backed up that assessment with action, filing lawsuits against 6 companies seeking 4.8 trillion rupiah, which is $284 million in environmental damages.
Let's name these companies. According to Mungabe's investigation, the defendants include PT Toba Pulp Lestari, a pulpwood producer that's part of the April conglomerate and has been involved in land disputes with local communities. There's China-backed PT North Sumatra Hydro Energy, which is building a hydropower dam directly into Tepanuli orangutan habitat. And there's UK-owned PT Agincourt Resources, which operates the Mart Abe gold mine within the orangutans' range.
The evidence is damning. Investigators found that these companies cleared 2,516 hectares, that's over 6,000 acres, of rainforest, particularly in and around the Badong Toru and Garoga watersheds. These are exactly the areas that flooded catastrophically. When you remove that much forest cover, you remove the natural infrastructure that prevents flooding.
Beyond the lawsuits, Indonesia announced it will revoke permits held by 28 resource companies, including some of the country's largest mining operations. This is significant governmental action, and it's desperately needed according to conservationists. But we have to ask, why were these permits granted in the first place? Why was industrial extraction allowed to proceed in the habitat of a critically endangered species?
The answer is the same as it always is: profit. The Mart Abe gold mine, operated by PT Agincourt Resources, has been controversial for years. A 2024 Mungabe investigation found that efforts to mitigate the mine's impact on orangutans were hit by stonewalling and data secrecy. The company refused to share crucial environmental data, making it impossible for conservationists to assess the true damage.
And the hydropower dam being built by PT North Sumatra Hydro Energy represents another dimension of this crisis. Hydropower is often marketed as green energy, a climate solution. But when you're destroying the habitat of the world's rarest ape to build it, when you're clear-cutting rainforest that serves as a natural flood barrier, is that really environmentally sustainable? Or is it greenwashing that serves corporate interests while devastating ecosystems?
This case reveals a brutal irony at the heart of so-called sustainable development. Companies claim they're contributing to economic growth, to energy independence, to lifting people out of poverty. But the reality on the ground is dead orangutans, destroyed forests, and over 1,000 human lives lost to floods that were fundamentally man-made disasters, amplified by corporate greed.
Now let's shift to Central Asia, where climate change is colliding with authoritarianism in ways that should alarm everyone. According to an analysis published in the Diplomat this month, Central Asia has maintained what scholars call an illiberal peace since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, relative stability without democracy, managed by authoritarian regimes. But that stability is being tested by an environmental crisis that authoritarian governance is fundamentally incapable of solving.
The crisis is water. Central Asia is experiencing some of the most severe water stress on the planet. According to research published by the Caspian Policy Center and the United Nations Development Programme, temperatures in the region are rising faster than the global average, and glaciers are melting at accelerated rates. This matters because roughly 80% of Central Asia's river flow comes from glacier and snowmelt.
Let's look at the specific impacts. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are classified in a severe water stress category, and the situation is deteriorating. In Kazakhstan, increasingly severe and longer droughts now affect 2/3 of the country. More than 500,000 people in almost 1,400 Kazakh villages currently lack access to drinking water. Many families have water for only a few hours a day.
And here's where authoritarianism makes everything worse. After 1991, Central Asian leadership embraced authoritarian models, and according to analysis from the Atlantic Council and Daily Sabah, these leaders have lacked the political will to solve regional water challenges either domestically or internationally. The political landscape ranges from strongly authoritarian Turkmenistan to the somewhat more open Kazakhstan, but none of these governments have the transparency, accountability, or democratic engagement necessary to address a crisis of this magnitude.
The numbers are staggering. Up to 37% of all Central Asian water is lost due to mismanagement and obsolete Soviet-era technologies. Transboundary water agreements, which are essential because rivers don't respect national borders, remain largely ineffective. The cost of inaction on improving water management is estimated at $4.5 billion annually, and droughts are costing the region over 5% of its GDP.
For Uzbekistan, the situation is particularly precarious. Around 80% of Uzbekistan's water originates from neighboring countries, leaving it completely vulnerable to upstream water management decisions. The government has stated that a third of its population lives in areas prone to disasters and environmental degradation, and 90% of agricultural land needs artificial irrigation in a region where water is rapidly disappearing.
This is a recipe for catastrophe. You have authoritarian governments that prioritize regime stability over environmental sustainability, Soviet-era infrastructure that's failing, no functioning mechanisms for regional cooperation, and climate change accelerating faster than anywhere else on Earth. When the glaciers are gone, and at current rates, that's not a distant future scenario. What happens to 500 million people who depend on that water?
And let's connect this to the broader pattern we're exploring tonight. Just as in Guinea-Bissau and Indonesia, the people who will suffer most from this crisis are those with the least power. Authoritarian regimes in Central Asia have enriched elites while ordinary citizens face water shortages that threaten their basic survival. The same exploitation, just a different mechanism.
Finally, let's turn to Nepal, where something potentially transformative happened last year. In September 2025, a Gen Z-led uprising brought down the government. According to reporting from Britannica and Harvard's Atrocity Prevention Lab, students and young citizens organized massive protests across the country, motivated by corruption, government displays of wealth while ordinary people struggled, and the mismanagement of public funds.
The immediate trigger was the government's September 4 decision to suspend 26 social media platforms, a move widely seen as an attempt to silence dissent. But the deeper causes were structural: rising costs of living, inflation, unemployment, and the devastating impacts of climate change and COVID-19 lockdowns. As NPR and East Asia Forum reported, South Asia faces climate-induced disasters and economic instability, with high literacy rates but massive underemployment.
The protests turned violent. Parliament and government offices were set ablaze. At least 73 people were killed. But on September 9, Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli resigned. 3 days later, Sushila Karki was appointed interim prime minister, Nepal's first female prime minister, and elections were scheduled for March 5, 2026.
Here's what makes this significant: the elections have seen an unprecedented surge in political participation. According to Wikipedia and the Diplomat, 114 political parties have been approved to contest, more than one-third emerged after the uprising. Over 68 parties are fielding candidates. Thousands of people are running for office.
Among the new political forces is an alliance between Rabi Lamakane's Rastriya Swatantra Party, Kathmandu's popular mayor Bailendra Shah, and Kulman Gaising's Ajayalo Nepal Party. Mayor Shah, who couldn't participate in the initial Gen Z protests because organizers set an age limit of under 28, became a key figure in supporting the movement and backed Sushila Karki's appointment as interim leader.
Now here's the question: will this uprising actually change anything? Nepal has a long history of political instability, corruption, and elite capture. The elections happening in just weeks will test whether the energy unleashed by young people can break the cycle of transactional politics. As the Diplomat noted, established parties like the Nepali Congress and Nepal Communist Party still wield enormous power.
But there's something qualitatively different about a youth-led movement in 2026. These are people who've grown up with climate change as an existential reality, not a future threat. They've seen how corruption and mismanagement make climate impacts worse. They're digitally connected, harder to silence, and they're not asking for incremental reform, they're demanding transformation.
And that brings us to the synthesis. What connects Guinea-Bissau, Indonesia, Central Asia, and Nepal? What's the pattern we need to see?
It's this: in every case, we're seeing the collision between entrenched power structures, whether colonial medical research, extractive corporations, authoritarian regimes, or corrupt political elites, and growing resistance from populations who are bearing the costs of exploitation.
In Guinea-Bissau, African health officials are asserting sovereignty against American attempts to use their children as test subjects. In Indonesia, the government is suing companies that prioritized profit over ecosystem protection, leading to catastrophe. In Central Asia, environmental crisis is exposing the failures of authoritarian governance. In Nepal, young people are literally burning down the system that's failed them.
These aren't separate stories. They're chapters in the same story, the story of a world where a small number of powerful actors extract wealth and resources while externalizing the costs onto vulnerable populations and fragile ecosystems. Medical colonialism, environmental destruction, climate crisis, and political corruption are all manifestations of the same underlying logic: some lives matter more than others, some profits justify any cost.
But what's also consistent is resistance. Guinea-Bissau said no to the vaccine study. Indonesia is holding corporations accountable. Nepal's youth are demanding change. These aren't guaranteed victories. Power doesn't surrender easily. But they represent a refusal to accept exploitation as inevitable.
And here's what we need to understand: climate change is going to make all of this worse. The floods that killed Tepanuli orangutans and over 1,000 people in Indonesia, those are going to become more frequent and more severe. The water crisis in Central Asia, it's accelerating. The conditions that drove Nepal's uprising, climate disasters, economic instability, resource scarcity, those are the future for billions of people unless we fundamentally change who has power and how it's used.
So what do? First, we connect the dots. We see that a vaccine study in Guinea-Bissau, mining in Indonesia, water scarcity in Central Asia, and an uprising in Nepal are all part of the same system. We stop treating these as isolated incidents and start seeing the pattern.
Second, we support resistance wherever it emerges. When African health officials assert sovereignty, when governments sue extractive corporations, when young people demand accountability, those are the pressure points where change becomes possible. That's where our attention, our solidarity, and our resources need to go.
Third, we name the system for what it is. This isn't a series of unfortunate events or policy mistakes. It's a global economic and political order built on exploitation, where a small elite accumulates wealth by extracting it from people and ecosystems that have no power to refuse. Until we're willing to call that out and demand alternatives, nothing fundamental changes.
And finally, we recognize that time is running out. The Tepanuli orangutan might not survive another flood like the one in 2025. Central Asia's glaciers won't last another century at current warming rates. The next generation in Nepal and across the global south won't accept the same corrupt bargains their parents were forced to endure. We're living through the last years when incremental change might be enough.
The stories we've covered tonight aren't comfortable. They're about power, exploitation, and systems that value profit over life. But they're also about resistance, about people refusing to be sacrificed for someone else's benefit. That resistance is where hope lies, not in optimism that things will magically improve, but in the determination to fight for a different world.
In Guinea-Bissau, that means protecting African children from being used as test subjects. In Indonesia, it means holding corporations accountable for environmental destruction. In Central Asia, it means building democratic systems that can actually address climate crisis. In Nepal, it means young people transforming anger into political power.
And everywhere, it means recognizing that we're connected, that an unethical medical study in West Africa, floods in Sumatra, water scarcity in Kazakhstan, and an uprising in Kathmandu are all part of the same struggle. The struggle for dignity, for justice, for a world where human rights and ecological limits are non-negotiable.
That's Truth Report for tonight. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Keep questioning. Keep resisting. And keep connecting the dots.